Hi, welcome, and we'll start off with our bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So, so we're, of course, in Parshat Emor, and also these we've been dealing with all kinds of blemishes, whether of priests themselves or the animals that are to be, or should I say, not to be placed on the altar. That it has to do, I feel, in general, with looking at the kind of inner preparation one has to do in order to present oneself before the sovereign and the creator of the universe. That it's that awareness. And of course, my sense about religion in general has to do with what's our relationship. It's one of the questions, the basic fundamental questions of religion is what is our relationship? What is my relationship to the universe? What is that relationship? And what does that relationship need to be? But I think there's something very wonderful, even if it's not necessarily that difficult to understand, in saying that in drawing oneself to the creator, this ultimate power in which the universe operates, there's a lot of preparation that needs to be done. One of the things that's really terrible are people who are outwardly religious, and then it turns out that they have some serious flaws in their personalities, etc. And it's a tough one. And because we are created with a dark side, and actually, I also feel that one of the ideas of religion is to help us uh, work with our dark side. I don't think it's there to necessarily expunge it, but I sometimes like using a metaphor of dancing a dance, not letting that dark side overpower us, but to utilize the energy that comes from that side of us to rather try and redirect it towards things that involve righteousness and righteous behavior, and possibly to give us a measure as to the devotion that we need to have towards righteous behavior. So I think that's sort of an underlying theme of this particular parsha. And in discussing in Leviticus, talking so much about spiritual purity and impurity and things like that. I think they're all connected, also, of course, with immortality. So, going on here, Vaidaber Hashem el Moshe, Hashem, God spoke to Moses, Lamor, saying, and now we're coming to the actual offerings themselves, right? Sure, an ox or kesev or a sheep or or a goat. So those are the three basic categories of animals that can be offered up as a sacrifice. So again, there, it's limited. It isn't just anything. It's limited to these three types of animal. Ki yivaled. But here we go. Look at this particular. We've been talking about offerings, but here we're talking about ki yivaled, when it uh, gives birth, right? When a child is born to it, or when offspring, not a child, but offspring is born to it. V'haya shiva yamim tachat imo. It should remain for 7 days with its mother. Umiyom hashmini v'hala, but from the 8th day and onwards, yeratzeh lekorban ishel Adonai, it shall be considered it shall be accepted as an offering, a fire by fire to God. So that's also, I think, there are quite possibly some deep thoughts going on underneath this all, right? So let's just do the Rashi, and then we'll try and see if we can uncover a few thoughts anyway, or a thought. Ki yivaled. So it says, so why does the Torah use this particular term? So yivaled has to do with giving birth, right? And that gives birth. So I translated it differently when I did the initial translation, but Rashi is correcting me here, and to understand that it means gives birth. Right. So what is this? this excluding? Why that we're saying it has offspring, right? But why that term to give birth? And Rashi gives, this is based on a Talmudic interpretation, prat leyotzei dofan. That is to exclude a cesarean section. That if this animal has to have a cesarean section, it would mean it has not gone through the process of actually giving birth. And so this law does not apply to this particular situation. Now, exactly what are the implications? Does that mean that even the offspring, the calf or the lamb or the kid is not to be accepted on the altar? I would hazard a guess, and it is a guess, that that would in fact be the case. Although what it seems to be saying is you don't have to wait the 7 days. But this is why we have all these commentaries here that possibly will clarify that. But right now, what we're saying is this law does not apply, but it could also not apply in the sense of the latter part of this law, which says that afterwards, right, that from 8 days and on, it can be acceptable as an offering. So, Veshor oseh, an ox or a bull, I should say perhaps, oseh, or a sheep, oto ve'et beno, it and its child, its offspring, right? Literally it means son. Lo tishchatu, you shall not slaughter, excuse me, b'yom echad, on the same day. You cannot do that kind of thing. So again, we'll take a look at how this actually gets played out. Oto, it and its offspring. And this is from the Sifra and also the tractate Chulin, which deals with non-sacrificial meat. And this is actually now just talking in general about an act of slaughter. That's the subject of these last two sentences, of certain conditions that are involved in the practice of slaughtering. Right? Noheg ben nekeva. He's saying that this law applies to the female. In other words, when a cow calves, it's not that she'asur lishchot ha'em v'haben or habat, that it is forbidden to slaughter the mother and the child, or the daughter, the son or the daughter, right? The male or female calf, right? In one day, on the same day. You're not to do it. And this applies to non-sacrificial meat as well. So even today, there's a prohibition against slaughtering both the cow and the calf on the same day. Again, I wonder to myself if this has a lot to do with the idea that we don't have complete ownership over anything, and not even over the animals that we own. And so that there has to be a level of respect and maybe we could say even compassion regarding such practices. But I think that there are many other laws, especially the agricultural laws in the Torah, that want us to understand that we don't own anything, that we have the right to use it, that God gives us, our Creator, the Creator of the universe, gives us a right to use these things, but to do it with certain rules. So it's as if we're more like renters than we are owners. And that's why there are these kind of rules. And we don't own life, especially here we're talking about living objects, living creatures, and to understand that there is a certain way in which that the Torah is mandating us in which not to act in these kind of cruel, uh, inconsiderate kinds of ways. So we're saying, though, this doesn't apply to a bull and the calf that it sired. It's referring to the cow. Right, it just does, even though it's in the male, this is in the male gender here. Ve'enonoheg, he says, and it doesn't apply bazcharim, with males. In other words, it's strictly talking about the mother and the offspring. Umutar, And he goes on to say even more specifically, umutar lishchot ha'av v'haben. And in this case, though, it is permissible to slaughter the bull and the calf that it might have sired on the same day. And here we're talking about slaughtering for the sake of consumption. Okay. But it would certainly also apply in terms of all the more to sacrifices. Oto ve'et beno, right? It and its son, literally. Af beno. So in other words, what happens if you want to slaughter the son and then the cow, right, or the calf and then the cow? It's saying af beno ve'oto b'mashma, referring to the reverse order. This applies to the reverse order as well. In other words, not only are you not allowed to slaughter the mother first and then the calf second, you're also forbidden to slaughter the calf first and the mother second. It doesn't matter. That's the otove, meaning it and its calf, which would mean, in a sense, the same time, right? At the same time period. Can't do it on the same day. V'ki tizbechu zevach todah, and should you offer up an offering of thanksgiving, Lashem, to God, lirtzonchem tizbachu, you should do it in order to find favor. The way in which you're going to do this, if you want to offer this thanksgiving offering to God, you want to do it in a way that you'll find favor by doing it. Lirtzonchem tizbachu, right? So that you shall slaughter it in a way that you will find favor. Tchilat, so here we go. In other words, the way in which you do it, right? The way in which you perform this sacrifice. Tchilat zvichatchem haru. At the very beginning of this process, at the very beginning of your slaughtering, haru. Be careful that it should be done in a way that it will be that it will find favor for you, that you'll be able to find favor and do this. Uma haratzon, and so what is that, in fact, act of being able to find favor? So let's take a look. Vayom hahu, on that same day, this is now where you're slaughtering for this as an offering, right? It's a very special kind of sacrifice. It's as a sacrifice. It's not chulin. It's not for personal consumption. It's for the sake of making an offering to God, right? And as for a thanksgiving offering, it says, Vayom hahu ye'achel, it shall be eaten on that same day, the day that it's slaughtered. Lo tutiru mimenu, do not leave any leftovers ad boker, until the next morning. Ani Hashem, I am the Lord. Now, this is sounding like this is the commandment regarding cow, but you'll see that what we're talking about here, because it talks about doing it in such a way that it finds favor, we're saying that what you have in mind when you slaughter it is significant, right? And that's what Rashi's talking about here. Vayom hahu ye'achel. Lo ba, so on that day it shall be consumed. Lo ba lahazir, this law is not coming to warn, ella shetahei, is only coming to the purpose of this law is coming to warn, shetahei shchita al menat kain, that when you actually slaughter the animal, you do it with that intention of eating it only on that day. That knowing ahead of time that that's the way it has to go. If you were to slaughter it with a different intention of saying, well, no, I would eat it over 3 days or whatever, then it will not be acceptable. So your very intention of doing this has to be within the framework that God has set, right? Almanat Kain. Al tishchatuhu, do not slaughter it. Almanat la'ocho lemachar. In that when you do it, you're going to say, okay, I'm slaughtering it today, but my intention in slaughtering it is to eat it, to consume it tomorrow, right? When this verse is saying on that same day. So here we're talking, as I said, about one's intention. She'im tachshavu bo machshavat pasul, because if when you're actually slaughtering it, you have in mind an unfit, an unworthy thought, right? Lo yehelachem l'ratzon. It will not be something that will find favor. You will not be able to find favor. If at your very initial intention, even before you touch the animal itself, right, that when you actually slaughter the animal, it has to be with the right intention. Davar acher, another
Rabbi,
interpretation. Yes, sorry, Mike. I do see your
uh,
yes.
so when they slaughter an animal, it always had to be eaten on the same day.
We're talking now about a zevach todah. We're talking about a Thanksgiving offering. There were other sacrifices like shlamim where you could eat it over 2 days, or even 2 days and a night. But this is this particular offering. So
They never could save anything.
say that again.
They couldn't save anything.
No, they could not
Never.
have. The idea was not to have leftovers.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah. Davar acher, another interpretation. Lirtzonchem, in other words, wherein it says, so that you find favor. Ratzon is desire, right? He says, leda'atchem, that by the lirtzonchem, we're understanding this word to mean with full intention, perfect concentration. Mikan, and from here one can infer lemit asek shepasul, that if when they're slaughtering this animal, they're not fully concentrating on what they're doing, that animal will not be fit to place on the altar. So the whole notion of doing something with complete intention is here. Has to be practiced. So priests who, although, by the way, it's only from the point once the animal has actually been slaughtered that the blood is then taken by the priests, and the rest of whatever is done to the animal has to be done by priests. But in fact, a non-priest is allowed to slaughter a sacrifice. So if a non-priest is doing this, he also has to be very, very conscious of what he's doing. Okay? Bishchitat kochim, that when it comes to the slaughter of sacred animals, right, for the sanctuary, a person has to do it with complete intention. For afalpi, and despite the fact, sheparat b'nechalim shnei yamim, he says we'll see, back earlier on in Leviticus, and this is Leviticus 7:18 here, right? Here's the reference, right? That despite the fact that earlier on it specified animals that were eaten over 2 days, right? Chazar uparat b'nechalim liyom echad. It nevertheless comes back and now mentions animals that are eaten on one day, right? It did it earlier on, but now it's talking about animals eaten in one day, the same particular law. That is to say, that when they are slaughtered, that one has to do it with the intention of eating them within the time period that the Torah sets for that particular kind of sacrifice, right? Let's see here. I made some notes here just to try and clarify, right? Let's see, right? So I can just read this. In other words, while it has already been mentioned, the Torah has already mentioned the initial intention when sacrificed must be for the prescribed time. With regard to sacrifices that are eaten over 2 days, it repeats the law here with respect to sacrifices that can only be eaten for one. In other words, so one of the things this is informing you is how important this particular principle is. And so the idea is that when we are in direct service to our Creator, when we're in the presence of our Creator, to try and focus and concentrate as much as we can. So let's keep going. Bayom hahu yachel, it may be eaten on that day. Lo totiru mimenu ad boker, right? Do not leave over of it until the next morning. Ani Hashem, I am the Lord. read that, but here goes. We then went back into the Rashi that was about the previous verse. Vayomahu yechel, on that very day it shall be consumed. Lo ba lahazir, so here, Ella, so it only comes here to give you this warning, this prohibition. Shetehei shchita al menatchem. It's coming to tell you that when you slaughter the animal, it has to be with this particular purpose. She'im likvoa lo zman achila, right? Because if it's simply coming to teach you about the proper times to be designated for animals, right, that are slaughtered, if that's all it's coming to teach you, and not to tell you that your intention when you're slaughtering it has to be proper, right? Kfar Kativ, it's already been mentioned, right, back in Leviticus chapter 7, here where it says, and he's quoting, Uvasar Zevach Todah, and the meat of a Thanksgiving offering, Shlamav, its peace offerings, etc., etc. In other words, back there in Leviticus 7, it talks specifically about not leaving it over. You have to dispose of it before the next day. Right. So in the first part, we were saying when it has to be consumed, but in the second part, we're being told that whatever is not consumed within the correct time period has to be disposed in a proper way. So I think they would take it outside the camp and burn any remnants in a sacred place outside, in a place that is pure outside the camp. I believe that's the way they'd handle it. Ani Hashem, and ending off with this, I am the Lord. What does that really tell you? Da, no. Mi gazar al hadavar. Just know who made this command, who made this edict, right? For al yakel beinecha, do not consider it light in your eyes. Do not consider it unimportant and insignificant. So, velo tachalalu et shem kodeshi, that you not profane my holy name, v'nikdashti, that I may be sanctified, betoch b'nei Yisrael, in the midst of the children of Israel. Ani Hashem mekadishchem, I am the Lord who makes you sacred, who sanctifies you. Okay. So let's go on here. Ushmartim, let's see. Right. Ushmartim mitzvotai v'asitem otam. I think I skipped this sentence. So, ushmartem mitzvotai, you shall guard my mitzvot, my commandments, v'asitem otam, and you shall practice them. Ani Hashem, I am the Lord. So, ushmartem, you shall guard them, and this is from the Sifra Zo HaMishnah. So guarding them has to do with reviewing them, studying these laws, vasitem, and perform them, zehamase. This has to do with actually putting them into practice, because obviously you can study about these laws, but it doesn't mean you're actually practicing them. And so that's why there's this ushmartem vasitem, why you have these two verbs here. So going on, v'lo techalalu, so that you not profane. La'avor al dvarai mizidim, so to transgress my words intentionally. Mimashma shneemar, that we learn from the phrase v'lo techalalu, right, where it says you shall not profane. Ma talmud lomar v'nikdashti. So what do we learn then from the statement that says you shall sanctify? In other words, when it tells you you shall not profane, it's telling you that you shouldn't intentionally do things in order to profane God, right? So that's not a question of ignorance. This is where you know the law, you've learned it, you've studied it, and you still choose not to practice it. So that, in other words, you now have made the decision to do it intentionally. So we learn that from V'nikdashti, right? So sorry, we learned it from Lo Techalalu, you shall not profane. So what does this Nikdashti add? What is this I shall become sanctified? Masor atzmacha, dedicate yourself, the Kadesh Shmi, and sanctify my name. Yachol b'yachid. Okay, so exactly what the sanctification involves, we'll see in a moment. Yachol b'yachid. Maybe this applies to an individual who's all by himself. Talmud lomar, and for this reason it goes on to say, betoch bnei Yisrael, in the midst of the children of Israel. In other words, if you're all by yourself, and you're going to see, we're talking now about martyrdom, that it's saying that I believe that what it's saying is that if you are given the choice of martyrdom and you're all by yourself, you can choose not to accept martyrdom. But if you're in the community and if you're amongst other Jews, b'toch b'nei Yisrael, right, then you have to accept martyrdom. Ukeshehu moser atzmor, and when he in fact hands himself over to be killed, to be martyred. Imsor atzmo, you should hand yourself over, al menat lamut, knowing that you will die. In other words, that you yourself, and this is its connection, right, to what we're talking about with sacrifices here, is that you become the sacrifice. And when you're doing this in the midst of the people, with others around, seeing what's going to happen, right? You need to go ahead and do it, understanding that you'll be killed. Shekol hamoser atzmo amenat hanes. In other words, don't expect God to deliver you. In other words, if you in fact turn yourself over and offer yourself up with the proviso that God perform a miracle for you, with having that in mind, right? Ein osim lo nes. No miracle is performed for that person. Chicane going on. Chicane, because thus Matzinu, we find Bechananya, Mishael, Azariah. With this is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This is their Hebrew names in the book of Daniel, who were thrown into the fiery furnace, right? Shalom,
Rabbi,
yeah, yeah.
sorry, I'm trying to raise my hand, but you don't see it,
I'm
right?
not
You
seeing
never.
it. No, I'm not seeing it now. No, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
Go on.
The question about martyrdom. So if we're alone and nobody sees us, then we don't need to do it. So does that mean that? But what about the case where word gets back to everyone else that what happened?
Right. So I think that would be a circumstance that would alter the case. In other words, then it is as if you're doing it in front of everybody.
Oh,
If
okay,
you know that everybody's going to find out about it, well, it's like you're doing it in front of everybody. At least that's
okay,
the way I'd understand it. It's talking about, basically in a very private situation. You don't have to perform private martyrdom. But here we're talking about knowing, expecting, and anticipating that you will in fact die. So we're giving this example of in the book of Daniel of the three who were thrown into the fiery furnace, and we know in their case a miracle was performed. Shelo matzru atzman al menat hanes, because we know for a fact that they did not anticipate that a miracle would be performed on their behalf and that they would come out of it unscathed. And how do we know this? Shinemar, as it states, this is in the book of Daniel, chapter 3. This is where the three of them are speaking to the king who was going to throw them in. Ve'hein lo yedia laho lacha malka. And in other words, you should know, O king, right? The Malka Vagomer, meaning Matzil velo Matzil going on. So you should know, Lord, excuse me, you should know, O King, that whether God saves us, Matzil saves us, velo Matzil, or God doesn't save us, Yedia I think leheve lecha. You should be aware that we are committing ourselves to this. We are accepting this act of martyrdom, whether God saves us or doesn't. And I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and look at the passages and I'm not sure if it was Nebuchadnezzar who was doing this, to them. But at any rate, that he was testing them, that the king was testing them to see whether God would save them. In other words, because they believed in God and had this firm faith, and they were saying to the king, whether or not God saves us, we still are willing to commit martyrdom for the sake of worship God. Hamotzi etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim, in other words, God who took you out of the land of Egypt, liyot lachem Elohim, in order to serve as your God, as your Elohim, ani Hashem, I am the Lord. Right. So Hamotzi etchem. In other words, the reason I took you out of Egypt was so that you would serve me. Right? Amanat for that purpose. Ani Hashem, and this last statement of I am the Lord. Ne'eman, I can be counted on. I'm faithful. Leshalem schar, to pay reward, to reward those who serve me. So this is obviously a good place for us to stop for today, and we'll try and pick it up again next time. So right here.
I read something yesterday. I'm reading the Heavenly Torah, and
Yes.
it said that I think Herschel was the author thinks that, or somebody thinks that the Talmud has a lot of scientific logic in it, among other stuff. Do you agree?
So I'm not sure if by scientific logic you're saying that it has rational arguments, then absolutely. It's full of carefully and deeply worked out arguments, whether it's for a particular case. It actually analyzes what is found in the Mishnah, and it represents the discussions that took place in order to deconstruct the Mishnah and have a full understanding of the Mishnah in the context of other legal material from that particular time. So there, if one considers that scientific arguments, that would be legal science. Yes, no question about it. It's very
Wait,
rigorous. It's rigorous.
are you talking about the Gemara?
Yes, that's what we're talking about. I assume
Oh,
that's what
so the
we're talking
Gemara.
about. I said probably Talmud, but I did mean the Gemara. Yes.
Yeah, you said something about Mishnah. Something
Right.
was looking at Mishnah.
Correct. The Gemara is the discussions that took place in the academies in analyzing the Mishnah. So the way that
Oh, okay, yeah.
is that you'll have a Mishnah, and then you will have the discussion that follows on that Mishnah to
I agree.
get a
Yeah,
better understanding. Yeah. Okay.
yeah. Thanks for
Sure.
pinning that down.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to stop the recording.